welcome to this week's Property Matters on Dublin South FM, the show that brings global trends to an Irish audience. You can contact us on Twitter at i3PT Radio or by email at hello@ipropertyradio.com. Your host for today is myself, Carol Talon. Due to ongoing COVID-19 restrictions, we're still recording remotely, so please accept our apologies for any sound quality or any sound inconsistencies. We're obviously doing our best with the technology at hand. I'm delighted to be joined now remotely, of course, by Orla Hegarty, Assistant Professor in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at UCD. Orla, thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning, Carol.
So, Orla, you've been one of the most outspoken and, dare I say, interesting commentators in the property sector, talking about maybe policy changes, things that really need to happen. And it feels like now, as the market is in absolute disruption, possibly in ways that are very different to what we saw in the recession a decade ago, it feels like this is really the time to maybe have a conversation and see if these things can be progressed. So let's start by saying, what are you seeing in the marketplace at the moment? Obviously, I assume your lectures are they being done remotely, or are things on hold?
Well, UCD is obviously the campus is closed at the moment, but teaching all moved online in the middle of March, which happened to be during the midterm break. So for a lot of students, they went on their midterm break and they didn't come back. So I think that through enormous effort on the part of a lot of people, that's been working fairly well, and they're now into the exam time of year.
Okay, and what happens for people, say, who are at, particularly, in their final year of exams? Are they operating on an assessment basis, or will the exams be held online?
The exams are happening online in various different formats, and obviously that's a complete change from what would have happened previously. People would have been used to exam halls, and I suppose it's a little bit like the Leaving Cert. Decisions had to be made to keep things moving, and there are people who are doing their finals at the moment. Yes, through that medium.
Yeah. That's a difficult one, but something struck me in advance of our conversation. That you're educating the next generation that will be involved in the design and build of our built environment. And we know that there's so much potential for change, so much potential for improvement. And we can see that technology, whether it's PropTech or planning, technology for the planning or construction, we can see that there's been a huge wave of innovation, certainly over the past 3 to 4 years. So this strikes me as a bit of a baptism of fire for the students leaving you and coming into industry. They are already embracing a future that maybe their more experienced colleagues, will be struggling to adapt to. So, how are you preparing, say, people in their final year? How are you preparing them for the industry that lies ahead?
Well, the students that I'm involved with are actually working. They're architecture graduates who are doing their professional exams. So they're actually out in the real world. So I have a sense of what's happening on their sites and in their projects as well. I think sometimes what people, see architects maybe as being building designers, they're actually trained as very complex problem solvers. Design is really about, how do you manage very complex problems? How do you pull solutions out of it? And how do you bring very big teams together over long periods of time in some kind of structured way to not lose sight of what you were doing and to achieve results. So I think that's a skill set that is really, really going to be terribly valuable as we come through this crisis and out of it, because there is no roadmap at the moment. We have no notion. We've often been in circumstances before where, there was some sense of how do you deal with a recession, or how do you deal with a disruption in a supply chain or something. But this is kind of seismic, I suppose, across, and it's global. So we don't have the outlet of emigration we had before for people out of the property and construction sector. We do now have them available to do work here, and we do have to decide how best to deploy those resources. So I think the people who are trained in areas like architecture, what they can bring to it is that flexible thinking and that kind of creative ability that isn't just about how you organise buildings and organise supply chains and put procurement in place, but is also much broader. And architects are educated in resources, in the built environment, in water, in sustainability, in a whole range of areas that are very relevant now to be brought into the mix.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about design going so far beyond, maybe what we might have typically thought about design into the more logistical side of it. And it's interesting. I heard Ger Fahy, the managing director of Horizon Offsite, and they're one of the leading offsite construction manufacturers in Ireland. And I heard him talk about how, design goes beyond the design of the building. It's the design, there's a lot of logistical solutions that need to be designed, whether it's the site, whether it's accessing the site, whether it's actually delivering a manufactured component to site and installing it under, in some cases, maybe some restrictions in terms of site size or access. So I think that's a really interesting point, that the design goes right across the sphere. But
yeah, and in changing conditions, I mean,
of course,
when as we work through this, things will be changing. As you can see with the health service having to be responsive every day to different conditions, and so it will be for everybody else. So we need people who can be quite responsive and also quite proactive. It's the thinker. It's really the creative people and the people who can get things done on a practical level who are going to be the most useful now.
Yeah, that I wonder, has that always been the case, and maybe it just got kind of buried under maybe some other layers of professional building up. But I think it's interesting when you talk about the need to approach this recovery, because it is a recovery of form, but it's not the recovery that we're used to talking about, say, from the previous recession. So I think it's interesting when you talk about the need to approach this very differently, because obviously it's a very different set of circumstances. But I understand when you say that we don't have the emigration option open to us. But one of the things we saw over the past decade is that Irish expertise, was moving beyond in the construction sector, and particularly across architecture, design, engineering. We saw it moving from an emigration model to really more of an export model, and technology enables that. So maybe is that something that we need to be focusing on right now for the current generation?
Well, I mean, certainly pre-corona, and it's just as valid now. I thought that for the government to take a much more proactive approach on climate change and the built environment, Ireland could have been a major exporter. We have the technical skill and ability here, and we also, could have used our housing program and our building program as the means to develop further innovation and to be the exporter of that. And that is a huge growth industry. It would be enormously supported by Europe under the new Green Deal. And it would have built permanent jobs here that wouldn't have been as susceptible to the kind of boom bust cycle that we are used to. Never mind all of the side benefits we would have by having, better quality building and retrofitted our own stock, which, obviously improves health, improves asset value and everything else. So I think now, is a really good time to start thinking like that as well. How do we build a new opportunities out of this, and all the people listen to who are in business will know that it's often how well you can adapt to circumstances and embrace kind of opportunities maybe that others don't see, that determine how you deal with difficult situations. And the idea of going back to what we had before, I think, would be a terrible mistake, because it wasn't working. What we had wasn't working. We were already seeing a drop off in housing supply before corona. We were already seeing the office and hotel market probably hitting their peak, and most people in the sector were saying we're back onto the same swings and roundabouts again of overproduction and people very stretched for a few years, and poor quality sometimes with that, and then a recession where people were left without work and without income. So we can't really buy into that cycle again.
And look, I agree with you. It doesn't make sense to restore something dysfunctional. It doesn't make sense to try to recover into a place that was familiar, but that didn't work and that didn't serve the country. There's been a lot of talk about how much capacity and output from the construction sector is going to be impacted for 2020, and that raises a really big question, because a couple of weeks ago I had the great pleasure of interviewing John McCartney, and economist, and he talked about the difference between the demand and the market. And I know a number of key developers, for example, Michael O'Flynn down in Cork has done the same thing. We seem to get confused in our market commentary. We seem to get confused when we talk about the size of the potential market as opposed to, the demand, people who want things as opposed to people who can actually are in a position to have their deposit, qualify for mortgage under the central bank rules, and actually have affordable property under those two factors within their area, close to their job, close to their kids' schools, whatever it is. So we seem to have made, there seems to be a disconnect between the figures that we call demand and then the market that can actually justify that. So if output drops, is that actually going to give us a bit of equilibrium as we go into 2021?
Well, I think you're right to draw, the distinction between the two things. I mean, if you go back about 100 years, I think something like a third of the population in Dublin lived in overcrowded tenements. So obviously there was an enormous need for housing, but there was no market for it. When people conflate population increase or, needs of people for housing with a market for housing, they're missing the point that people are only in the market if they can afford the housing that's on offer. And we were already seeing that affordability problem biting last year. Of the maybe 8,000 of new builds that actually came to market, up to 10% of them hadn't sold. So they were pitched into a market that was already saturated, and that would have been maybe the commuter belt housing or what the market was producing. There weren't enough people who could afford 350 or 400,000 pounds for a commuter belt house in Dublin. The market is at a different level, and I can understand why people in the property sector might want to, inflate demand figures because it gives more investor confidence, obviously. But we need to be real about it. If somebody is thinking now maybe of building a build-to-rent block with 200 apartments on the basis that they will all be, generating rent of 2,000 a month, I can't see that happening in an economy where 1 million people are on social welfare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, look, okay, if we take a step back, there's been a number of really good, positive initiatives over the past, certainly 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But we just haven't made inroads in terms of cracking the affordability nut. So what could we do, at a really fundamental level? What can government do to support that? What can industry do to fall in line where we're actually delivering affordable housing?
Well, I think we need to have a real conversation about I suppose what you might call the business model of our housing providers, and that goes way back, many years. But it's a speculative model whereby most of the profit was made on the land uplift, so through a rezoning, through a planning permission, through a more dense planning permission, through a rising market, and it is all predicated, I suppose, on a rising market and to some extent on conditions of that land changing in some way, building houses wasn't really the business. It was increasing the land value that was the business. And it's very, very cyclical. It's very precarious, as we can see at the moment. And it really relies generally on a rising market. Otherwise, it stalls. So we have bought into that boom-bust cycle and all of the fallout that goes with it. And that is what the cost is in. When developers talking about the high cost of producing housing, what they mean is they have a business model that is high risk, high return, and that the cost base of carrying land, speculating on land, speculative planning permissions, and all the risk that goes along with that is expensive. It's the risk that is expensive. The actual production costs of building housing is fairly straightforward and fairly affordable, and we could be producing housing for under 250,000, and by that I mean 3-bedroom houses or 2-bedroom apartments, but that hasn't been promoted, I suppose, as a solution for affordability in Dublin. It's been left to the market, and as we know, last year the market was looking for 2-bedroom apartments at 400,000 in Dublin, and there wasn't that many people who were taking it up.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting in terms of the property cycle. Is that almost a habit of the industry? Because if you think about it, this is one of the business ventures that ought not to be cyclical, or that ought to be very, very predictable, because we have data in terms of our population trends and spread. So therefore we should know not only what the demand is this year, but actually we should have a fairly good sense of what it is in 5 years' time and possibly even in 10 years' time. We also now are improving methodologies so that we can to facilitate a more rapid delivery. So we don't need to have this very long property development process. We can see that there are various efforts to speed up the planning process.
Well,
we can see that
sorry.
there's.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but it seems to me that this shouldn't be cyclical because, in fact, it's one of the most predictable. It should be one of the most predictable in terms of trends, just given the data that we have, in our citizens in terms of where they're living, what level of education they have, what income bracket they fall into, what size their household is. This shouldn't be as it shouldn't be speculative.
Well, I agree.
At this point.
We need real data, and I think a lot of the projections for housing demand have probably been overstated because they were based on, a certain GDP growth every year, and that justified building motorways and doing all sorts of things. But it wasn't really interrogated as to whether it was real. And if we're seeing a 10% fall in GDP this year, all those figures certainly need to be revisited in terms of the economy.
Mm-hmm.
The other point that I would take up from just what you were saying there, Carol, is in relation to planning. Planning has never been the problem. We have the same planning problem we had when we were building 90,000 houses a year in 2006. We've had a development sector who've been criticising the planning system since the early 1960s when it was put in place. So planning wasn't the problem. And in fact, all of the tweaking and playing around with the planning system in the last few years has actually delayed delivery of housing and added risk. So for any, mid-range developer who was trying to do a development, all of this chopping and changing on standards and delay has actually added risk and added cost in terms of carrying finance, and it didn't do them any favours at all. And a lot of the larger, some of the larger developers who would have been doing repeat planning applications or maybe higher buildings and smaller units on the back of it, it's hard to see now how any of that was justified. And I think, a stable planning system is what stabilises land values because it means everybody's on a level playing pitch and they have certainty for the next 6 years of the development plan cycle. And I think it's been quite retrograde. We missed the opportunity when there was investment money available over the last number of years by looking at the wrong things and by wasting, if you like, some of that opportunity in tweaking a planning system that just needed more resources. It didn't need structural change.
Really, but all of the industry appears to be calling for digital submission.
I totally agree on that, and
across
that's to
the
do
local
with
authorities. I mean, that's. Yeah, but that's a structural change that needs to happen. In fact, it's one of the things that's really hampering. Planning applications during this process.
That's not a legislative change, if you like. That's about resources and better systems, and I would completely agree with that. The idea of people, photocopying 10 copies of endless documents and delivering box loads to the local authority in this day and age is a waste of everybody's time and resources, and I'm sure a lot of them aren't even opened. I agree with that, but I mean in terms of legislative change, reducing standards for build to rent and social housing, lifting the height caps, changes to Part 5, all of these things have delayed development.
Yeah, actually, to me, that feels like almost a conversation for another day because I know we have to finish up now. But actually, I think that's really interesting because I would probably take the view that sometimes we call some of the standards that changed a reduction in standards when they were actually a change in standards or so I actually feel like that's almost a conversation.
We might have that again.
I would love to have with you. And I know you're rushing away to another appointment, and we need to finish up now. But let's put a pin in that, and we revisit that. We revisit that again because actually, I think it's something that I think it's something that we want changes to come out of this, but
Absolutely.
They need to be the right changes for the right reasons. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, listen, we'll leave it there for now. Our thanks again to Orla Hegarty, Assistant Professor in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at UCD. We need to take a quick break now. Stay tuned.
93.9 Dublin South FM.
Welcome back to Property Matters on Dublin South FM with myself, Carol Tallon. You can contact us on Twitter at iProperty Radio or by email at hello@ipropertyradio.com. I'm delighted now to be joined by Philip Matthews, Director at Turner & Townsend. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today, remotely, of course.
Morning, Carol. Thank you very much for having me.
No, delighted. Thank you. So, Philip, at Turner & Townsend, your team members are actually still working on essential projects. So you might just kind of let us know what's happening at the moment within your company.
From a T&T perspective, we're working, I have to say the transition has been quite smooth, albeit the odd time the internet goes down. But we use Skype for Business. Various clients use different video calls, video platforms, Teams, Blue Jeans. So we've all been used to that in the past. So the transition has been quite smooth. In terms of the essential projects, not every project is essential, but the key ones that we've been involved in is St. Eater's in Portrane, CUH in Cork, in terms of providing temporary facilities or acceleration of facilities to provide spaces or facilities just in case they're needed. We can't say at this point that they've been used. We don't have that information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, look, obviously your team was well set up and geared towards this, having an agile structure, but in terms of the clients that you're working with, how are they managing?
It varies from client to client. Some have had to transition. Some haven't been used to having video calls. By our nature, our business is quite personal. We have relationships with our clients and they're generally face-to-face. But, we do a lot of our managing of projects remotely. There's very little projects that need to happen in person these days. It's just transitioned with those clients and teaching our clients how to use the various technologies and prove to them that as a business, as an industry, that we can still keep going. And I have to say, comfortably, we've had the odd project that stopped. I think we all probably have suffered that experience. But the majority of the projects that are in design, we've been able to manage very efficiently.
Okay, and do you think that some of these, in terms of, say, interfacing with clients, do you think that these are processes that will stick beyond the restriction and shutdown?
It's unknown yet when our lifting of restrictions is going to happen. It's been socialised in the media that it's possibly this coming weekend, the bank holiday, and they're talking about essential sites and essential industries reopening, which we would hope construction is one of those. Certainly, it's one that's been intimated within the media. I don't see offices coming back quite as quickly. They're not an essential service or item to open. So I would see, the video meetings, the teams getting together on the video calls. I think that's going to continue. I don't think it's a bad thing either. We all have to play our part. And if we can keep socially distancing for another couple of months, as the government seems to be intimating we are required to do, we keep our businesses and our projects running. I see it'll maintain that test of endurance, resilience for these projects, and it'll demonstrate to our clients that we're able to do that and do it quite efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's certainly technology at the moment is being tested. A lot of the things that we've been using maybe that had, that had benefits, but were essentially more of a novelty than a necessity. Now they're a necessity and they're really being tested, and some are holding up very well and some aren't. And that's just the nature of innovation and testing new systems and technologies. But you have an advantage given that Turner & Townsend is a global organisation. So you have the advantage, say, in terms of restart and construction. You can look at your organisations in global economies where they have actually restarted the economy. So, for example, China, you issued last week, Turner & Townsend in Dublin issued a circular there on restarting construction sites in Ireland, taking the lessons that your colleagues in China had learned. So let's focus on that for a moment, because obviously we are hopeful that, while essential projects are ongoing now, we are hopeful that what's classified as essential is going to be broadened over the coming weeks and certainly months. So let's actually look at some of the specific lessons that have been learned from your colleagues in China when it came to restarting construction projects.
Sure. Part of the reason why we did this is to provide some insight to the industry, our clients, our colleagues, and design team partners out there. One thing we don't have in Ireland is anecdotal evidence of, this is a 1 in 100 event. So we've no evidence. We've had the shutdown. We don't know how quickly we're going to restart. We don't know how quickly we're going to get the numbers of workers, the supply chain back up to capacity or a new norm in terms of capacity. So this is one of the reasons we did this insight piece. So in terms of China, at this stage, they're 7 weeks on, roughly from a restart. They restarted on the 2nd of March. And similar to what's been implemented quite welcomely by the CAF here in Ireland, is they had to introduce measures at sort of macro level and micro site level in terms of looking at where, in terms of procedures, where was the staff returning from? Mm-hmm. Were they foreign workers? Were they local staff? If there were foreign, quarantine periods, 14-day periods, which again has been socialised in the media for Ireland over the weekend, they had to undergo tests to demonstrate that they were free from COVID-19 and they were fit to work. From a site perspective, there was mandatory temperature checks for all staff who were entering. Mm-hmm. There was inspectors on sites to ensure that the social distancing that were set out in the procedures were actually being followed. Face masks, face shields, they were mandatory. They were looking at, in terms of social distancing, looking at the canteens, the types of work that were being undertaken to ensure that they can be socially distanced. If they weren't, and there's times that they couldn't do that, which I think will be relevant here in Ireland as well, they had procedures in terms of the full PPE. And again, there was some negativity about some of the sites before the shutdown. There is types of jobs and activities in our industry that, there's a buddy system that'll prevail once this is lifted. So it's the common sense procedures that were implemented there, which I see similar in the CIF procedures, will have to be implemented here.
Yeah.
They had UV cleaning on sites. If there was a rota in terms of the use of the staff canteens as well as social distancing, and they were sanitised after each sitting of a group of site workers or site management. There was increased sanitation points on all the sites, and as I said a moment ago, inspection across all the sites.
Yeah.
So it's worked well. So at this point, 7 weeks on, sites are up to about 90% capacity in terms of resources. Although one anecdote they've noticed is that about 10% of the workforce still hasn't returned.
And, is that being attributed to them being in other geographical areas, or is it maybe that they have people within their home who have underlying conditions or health vulnerabilities that might preclude them from returning? Do we know what that is?
They don't have full insight to it yet. What they suspect, there's a mixture of that. There's also a fear still prevailing with people that they don't want to return.
Yeah. I think you've rightly pointed out that the Construction Industry Federation, they've done a tremendous job in actually taking the HSE guidelines and translating them into what that would actually look like on a building site. But the focus has very much been on a traditional building site. And it appears to me, and certainly in conversations with members of the off-site construction sector here in Ireland, that off-site construction and methods, more modern methods of construction, might actually be helpful in terms of designing in solutions to enable social distancing, but also in terms of catching up on programme delays and programme delays that are actually going to push some projects into a territory that just makes them not viable. So, do you break down the experience in terms of traditional and off-site construction?
No, we haven't broken that down as part of our insight, but I do share some of those beliefs. There is going to be types of work that can't maintain social distancing. I think this will be the moment, similar to us working from home and testing technologies. I think off-site construction, manufacturing such as this is going to do nothing but add positivity to a situation where people are afraid. There remains that fear, or it just proves impossible to do certain types of tasks in the future. There's going to be huge influx, I believe, in off-site construction and manufacturing.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of the general consensus. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of planning for new projects, but also for projects that maybe are at a stage of planning or early design and planning stage, if they will start to look towards off-site construction solutions. And I suppose it's possibly too early to say that now. But let's take kind of a macro level approach or a macro level view of the learnings that your organisation has shared internationally. We can see in China, you pointed out that there was an injection of government investment really to almost compensate for losses. So rather than pulling back on large capital or infrastructure projects, they've actually moved forward and committed further investment. Is that something you think we're likely to see here in Ireland?
We would hope that it will be the case, although Pascal Donoghue has issued a press release on the 14th of April, which has caused some concern in that it's pressed pause or created some anxiety in terms of the future viability of projects or whether projects in the public sector will go ahead. Granted, I appreciate the government has done a sterling job in terms of supporting the industry, people out there in terms of salary supports. But at this time, we really need to see greater investment by the government. We haven't had a stop due to economic activity. It's a once in a lifetime or 1 in 100 event. It's a virus. It's still very positive. Talking to a lot of the industry out there, the transactions that were taking place, they were saying Q1 was fantastic. It's probably one of the best they've ever had. So the virus has shut this down. So they need injections of money from the government investment to ensure the public capital works program maintains the pace that it was at, or perhaps even pick it up. Because the anecdotes from China so far is not all of private sector has restarted, but they're seeing huge influx of investment from government over there. Okay.
I know it's probably too early to ask you this, but do we know what we can expect from private projects?
What I can say in terms of our own experience, all of our clients that we're speaking with at the moment, because that's the new thing, we speak regularly to our clients, but it's even more important to do so now in this time of crisis, to give them that reassurance and the positivity that we're looking after their projects. So far, we've had no clients saying that they're stopping any projects within TNT. I would hope that's the evidence for the majority of my colleagues in the industry, that they see this as a short-lived item. There is worry, though, within some client bodies, within some of my peers that I speak to out there. There's an unknown in terms of the additional costs that the measures that COVID-19 has seen or will see us introduce will bring to projects in terms of program, the additional costs associated with the social distancing. They all are things that we don't have a full idea of yet. So there's an uncertainty with clients, but so far our clients are still on board. They still want to progress with projects.
Yeah.
But time will tell. We see a lot of talk in the media, of businesses that mightn't reopen after this. Hopefully they do. Mm-hmm. We want to go back to a functioning society, but we don't have a full answer to that yet, Carol.
Yeah, look, it's interesting, and all of the issues that you've brought up there that are there are uncertainties around. All of those are compounded by the fact that we don't know how that will play out on a contract basis as well. So, look, Philip, before we let you go, you might just look. Are there any practical measures that you can point out here that might actually help the Irish industry as they're preparing to return to building sites over the coming weeks and months?
Certainly, the CAF procedures that are there, I think they're a robust set of guidelines. They're not something that have to be followed to the letter. They're suggestions. There's guidelines in there. So, sites vary. They can't write instructions for every single site that's out there. It has to be practical. Uh-huh. Work with the CAF, our representative bodies out there, the SESI, RAI, Engineers Ireland, they're all coming out supporting the CAF procedures, coming out with their own procedures that complement those as well. I think they're practical measures we need to follow as an industry to get our industry back up and running. Maybe as a small note, broadband, it probably re-emphasises the need for the rural broadband, as a lot more people now are being forced to work and suffer with the lack of broadband out there, and maybe the investment in that.
Yeah, that's something I talk about every time Zoom goes down in our home office. So I definitely take that point on board. We'll leave it there for now. That was Philip Matthews, Director at Turner and Townsend. We need to take another quick break and we'll be back shortly. Stay tuned.
93.9 Dublin South FM.
And welcome back to Property Matters on Dublin South FM with myself, Carol Talon. We are still recording from home as the radio station is operating remotely in full compliance with government guidelines. I'm delighted to be joined over the phone by Eoin Leonard, CEO of i3PT certification. Eoin, thank you so much for joining us.
Delighted. Thanks for having me on, Carol.
Very good. Eoin, i3PT certification will be a well-known brand in the industry, but you might just let our audience know really what it is that you do.
Yeah, I suppose in a nutshell, the first thing people want to find out is what it stands for. i3PT obviously is an acronym, and we joke that that's what happens when engineers are left in charge of marketing. It stands for Independent Third Party Testing, and the company was established in 2012. I'm the founder and CEO, but the company was founded in 2012. It was fundamentally to assure quality in construction and to try to improve cultures on construction sites. So we do that kind of two key ways. One is through services, and the other is through our software division. And I suppose on the services side, where we'd be best known in Ireland is for delivering regulatory compliance as assigned certifiers. But we also offer clients technical advisory services where we sit client side and check design and construction throughout the project lifecycle. And on the services side, on the software side of our business, we have a software as a service application which manages construction projects, and that's called Cert Central. So we operate across Ireland and the UK at the moment, and we're planning to enter the US market probably towards the end of this year, depending on how everything goes.
Okay, and in terms of your SaaS model there, how long have you been offering the software solution?
The software solution has been, I suppose, it's been operational and working on projects since 2014 in Ireland and the UK. We only started offering it as a service and selling it effectively probably in the last 3 years. And it was the typical age-old story of we had developed Cert Central principally to manage our own process, which is a very rigorous process for managing quality on site. Mm-hmm. And the rigor that we applied for things like BCAR and for performance on projects, our clients kept coming back to us asking, well, could you track planning conditions using this system? And we said, oh yeah, you could do that. And we added that as a feature. And then we brought in design management features, and we brought in a version of a common data environment for managing design documentation and we're at a point now where it does everything from project management to process management, document management, quality management, design management. And it's a very rich tool at this point. So I guess it's currently in use on projects with something of a construction value in excess of 10.5 billion, I think at the last count. So it's being used to manage a pretty major list of projects. And it's everything.
Is that across Ireland and the UK?
Yeah, principally, yeah, Ireland and the UK. We've one or two outliers as well, kind of strange ones that wouldn't be typical projects that would be in the EU and with some of our multinational clients. But the bulk of our work is Ireland and the UK. We were in Manhattan back in November, meeting with some new clients over there, new potential clients. And I suppose one of the benefits of being in Ireland is we also have a lot of foreign direct investment clients who are based overseas who we're starting to work with a little bit more as well. But yeah, it's everything from social housing to premiership football stadiums, and everything in between. So data centers, I think the real benefit of our tool is it seems to be applicable to virtually every industry that we've worked in, and that can be modified and to be used in all of those areas. So yeah, it's been great.
That's an interesting one, because when we count the benefits of FDI projects in Ireland, I think that maybe we underestimate how they act as a springboard for Irish suppliers to access new markets. And yet we see in the startup culture that's a really important first step. So it's interesting to hear your experience of that. Yeah.
I think I've always talked about from an economic point of view, they say one of the key things to have for a very competitive sector is a sophisticated demand. And we absolutely have that in Ireland. And you see that when we go to the UK. I think for years when we would go to the UK and we would be going to meet a big client, we would always have that little bit of a nagging fear in the back of your head where you think, oh, geez, we're the small guys. Maybe we'll show them what we're doing. And they go, oh, sure, we've been doing that for years,
Yeah.
But what we find is actually because we're a small island, but we've a massively sophisticated demand from some of the biggest companies in the world, building very sophisticated and interesting projects over here, that when we go over there actually, and when we show them what we're doing and what we've developed, we're quite a ways ahead usually, we're always, I suppose we're not surprised by it anymore, but for the first few years we were always kind of surprised. And I guess there's a good friend of mine, he works at KPMG now, he Conor McCarthy, he would always say to me, the extra mile isn't a crowded place, and I think that's very true. And the Irish companies seem to do that very well.
Look, that's very true. Actually, you use the term sophisticated demand.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that I would usually associate with early adapters who are receptive to new technologies, but also who are well resourced to invest in new technologies. And, look, frankly, it hasn't always been our experience that the industry leaders are that they make up the sophisticated demand. So in Ireland, step away from the FDA clients for a moment in terms of the traditional sector in Ireland. Are they at the point where they are what you would call sophisticated consumers? Are they ready, and are they willing to resource this element of the business?
I think quality is recognised. If you break it up into its components, right? I think BIM is something that has been adopted pretty well. People see the benefit of it. Are they doing it well or correctly all the time? Certainly not. But there's a willingness to adopt BIM, and there's an understanding that it's something they should do. When we look at environmental certification, I think we've been pretty good to take that type of thing forward. The area that has probably lagged the most is quality. I think quality is an area, for a long time, it has been seen as something that's kind of nebulous and checklist based in construction. If you have the check sheets, you must have done it correctly, So I think the digitalization of that has been slow, but we are starting to see the demand. Certainly at main contractor level, they're getting much better, and there's an adoption of digital tools on site that's far greater than it would have been 3-4 years ago. I think BCAR to a large extent helped to precipitate that because the reporting requirement was greater immediately, and even if the legislation itself has some problems, I think the requirement for people to supervise and inspect more drove the adoption of new technologies in a way I hadn't seen before. But if you look at the CIOB in the UK, they've done some very interesting studies about the UK's performance and quality. We don't do the same types of studies here quite as often, but they took a very good look at themselves. And I think 3/4 of people surveyed felt that the quality was being managed very, very poorly. So I think we're at the beginning of where we can go with quality, I think, and construction doesn't deal with quality in the way that manufacturing and other people have dealt with it, and our productivity as a result and the amount of lost revenue through rework is drastic. I mean, in the UK last year or 2 years ago, I think it was, they surveyed and they found that the industry spent more on defects than they earned in profits. So in an industry that the margins are so razor tight, it's insane that you would spend more as an industry on fixing problems than you would on than you would actually accrue in profits over the course of the year. So there's a huge opportunity there for contractors and for everybody, really, for clients to avoid defects, disputes, and delays, destroying the value that everybody works so hard to create.
Yeah, well, actually, I've never heard those stats in terms of the losses on rework, so I definitely want to come back to that. But before we move on to quality, which is actually probably the driving issue right now, can I just ask you, because I've asked a number of the guests on the show over the past 15 months here, in terms of BIM adoption rates in Ireland, taking it that industry adoption rates of maybe 15% is considered a tipping point. Where do you think we are in Ireland in 2020?
To be honest, in terms of ratios, I wouldn't be certain. A lot of the clients that we're working with tend to be on the larger scale, right? So I think if you're looking at the larger scale projects and the high density projects, by and large, are operating using BIM now, or some level of BIM. Some of the BIM consultants that I would speak to on a regular basis would call it quasi BIM. It's not the full story, but it's an attempt at it. I think there's probably a misunderstanding as well. People will often talk about the 3D element of it, and everybody thinks it's about the model, but it's really about a process. It's about a methodology and a way of designing that's a little different. And I think that's probably where the challenge is. I think everybody understands that this is something I should do, but they don't often understand that it's going to change the way you work, right? So it's not just a software thing, and it's not just a consultant that you bring in. It's a new way of working, and I think that's the biggest challenge. So the willingness is there, and we would certainly see most of our projects that we're on now would have some degree of BIM integration or some degree of BIM involved in the project, but it's varying degrees, and it's a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B, So
okay,
yeah.
And what's driving that? Because we saw certainly over the past decade for larger projects, particularly FDI projects, that this was very much client driven. So what are you experiencing at the moment? Are people coming to embrace different methods of modern construction and methodologies? Are they adopting this because it is best practice, or are they adopting it because their clients are requiring it?
I think it's principally a client requirement, like most things in construction. I think it with all the best will in the world, if there's not a commercial case for doing something, people won't do it, and that's unless there's a really strong ethical reason for doing something, which we have seen some changes there. But by and large, I think people wanting to use BIM on construction projects, it tends to be more to do with the fact that it would be a requirement for a purchaser, or it would be a requirement for the property managers, the facility managers on buildings to have a federated model and I suppose accurate information, that golden thread that we hear about from Grenfell. I do think it's principally been driven from that. In the UK, we would have seen, that they brought it in at government level. They mandated that BIM level 2 had to be implemented on projects a number of years ago of a certain scale, and that would have, I suppose, in one sense, that would have driven the industry to a certain point anyway. And I think you talk about the tipping point. Once something like that happens, Ireland are starting to follow suit on their public projects as well. Once something like that happens, enough practices start to make the change. And actually, you don't have to mandate BIM anymore on projects after a certain point in time, because it's just how people do it,
Mm-hmm. And well, again, see, this is breaking down probably regulatory standards, established or emerging best practice, but also you're dealing with this cultural shift and a change of behaviours that needs to happen. Sure. You mentioned there the golden thread is recommended by the Hackett report post Grenfell. You might just explain that for listeners. Yeah,
so there was a series of recommendations made post the Grenfell disaster. So there was there's an inquiry that's still ongoing, and there was a lot of findings from that which were very, very interesting. And Ireland should probably pay close attention to what's going on there. But among the recommendations was that a digital golden thread of information should be stored for projects. So the term golden thread is used to describe a system or a methodology of capturing that. Now, that might not be one system, it could be multiple, but basically there has to be a methodology for capturing key decisions in a transparent and accountable way, which obviously from the point of view of what we've done with Start Central over the years, we've understood that since 2012, 2014, but we needed to have something like that because as a certification body that which is the way we're structured, we have to evidence to our own chief compliance officer, we have to evidence to external auditors as well, that we are capturing evidence of everything we do. So we've always had an understanding of that as a requirement, but that's not something that came from within the construction industry. Our chief compliance officer actually comes from the food business. So the guy that we brought in to run compliance in i3PT would have been a key consultant for some government stakeholders and government bodies in the area of agribusiness and food. So a lot of our methodology actually came from outside of construction. So I think that golden thread that's being talked about now and is being asked for is something that would exist in all kinds of other industries. There's always an audit trail or a decision tree that you can go back to and you can refer to those decisions. But if you look at the discovery emails that came out in the Grenfell inquiry, some of the conversations that were captured on email between design team members and contractors and manufacturers don't make for very good reading. And if that was to be captured in something like Start Central or any of the other tools that are out there that capture this information, people would not say the things they said on email in a system that everybody can see. And I think the key thing here is that there's a system for capturing that a decision has been made and the rationale for that decision in such a way that it will bear close scrutiny, but also records of inspection, records of defect management, records of certification and commissioning and everything else. It's not about paper, it's about the process. And I think the golden thread that they're calling for in the UK is something we've been doing a little bit of here for a while, to a greater or lesser extent. But they're really, they're about to change their regulations over there. They brought in a new building safety bill, which will have similar gateways to what we have for BCAR now in terms of issuing fire safety reports at planning stage and various other things that will have to go in at the earliest gateway, gateway 1. At gateway 2, which is pre-commencement, they're going to have to issue documentation to a building safety regulator, which appears to be similar in nature to what will go with a commencement notice for BCAR. And again, at completion stage, they'll have to send documentation and information to the building safety regulator for acceptance before they can actually use the building. So they have the people in the CIOB and other people have been looking closely at what has worked well in BCAR. I know from consultations over there, we've been speaking to a number of people, and we're actually engaging with the CIOB on a new study around the golden thread in the UK this year, which will be a national study. to see, I guess, how ready the industry is to take on those recommendations and how equipped they are to deliver it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and look, again, we're coming back to this situation where we're moving beyond there needing to be a commercial case to drive changes in the industry, and obviously that's where we need to get to. And I suppose very briefly before we let you go, Eoin, you've just detailed changes that are coming about as a result of one particular event, but also one trends that were in train over the past number of years, particularly in the UK. But obviously, in recent weeks, we've seen a huge change and the ground shifting from underneath the industry here in Ireland. What kind of changes are you seeing in work practices here?
Yeah, I guess it'll all come to light in the next few weeks. So certain projects are still open on site, and on those projects, there's major shifts in terms of how people are working. Obviously, the limitations on the number of people on the ground means that productivity is down massively. Anecdotally, that's in Ireland and the UK. So we're seeing productivity down anecdotally by as much as 30 to 40% on some sites. They're now starting to bring in new measures such as shift work, where one group will start working in the morning and that group continues to work together, and then in the evening another group takes over. So they're going to
okay. Eoin, as a driver or a proponent of modern methods of construction, when you see the traditional sector kind of scrambling for solutions like shift working, does it surprise you that the automatic thinking isn't going towards maybe a more manufacturer-driven process like offsite construction?
I do think people, there's definitely a willingness to do that. The commercial case is difficult at times. There's a few things there. I guess it tends to be quite a bit more expensive at the moment. I guess the issue for a lot of the clients that we've spoken to, we've a whole bunch of our clients have been keen to do it. And we're actually really keen to do it as well. We worked on a number of off-site construction projects actually to date. We're currently working on one of the largest in Europe right now for a client. I think it is the largest in Europe. And we've got buildings being constructed in Dallas, in Germany, in China, a whole bunch of different places where we're actually doing factory inspections and checking the work in the factory. Right. I guess the big risk with something like this is if it's not going to save a whole bunch of time on the program, which sometimes the savings in terms of time aren't necessarily there, and it's not going to be cheaper. It's sometimes difficult to make the case. It is the future, but it's 100% where it's going, Carol. And I think there will have to be some early adoption. There will have to be people who take a chance in it. And the difficulty for these guys is critical mass. There's a lot of guys doing offsite construction at the moment. We'll probably see some consolidation there. You've seen CISC have picked up an organisation in Ireland, and they've vertically integrated them. I know BAM have done likewise, and we're starting to see that as a trend in the UK as well. I think if there's a main contractor or developer attached to the offsite construction company or similar, it makes the revenue model a little bit better, and it probably makes the economies of scale greater. But we're just a little early, I think, in terms of it being the business case being there for some of our clients.
No, I think it's interesting to reflect that where productivity losses on foot of COVID-19 are estimated or forecast to be in the region of 30 to 40%, and then we know that some offsite construction methodologies can offer program savings of between 30 and 40%. It seems to me like a trend that's waiting to happen that might actually accelerate at this time. But I think maybe the next few weeks, months, and certainly into 2021 will tell a lot. But for now, that was Eoin Leonard, CEO of i3PT certification. Eoin, thank you so much for being with us today. That's it from us today. Thank you for listening into Property Matters on Dublin South FM, the show where property matters. You can get in touch with the show by emailing hello@ipropertyradio.com or on Twitter @ipropertyradio. Again, apologies for any sound quality issues. Obviously, as we're recording remotely, unfortunately, that's par for the course at the moment. Also, my thanks to Peter Rice on sound and show producer Katie Talon of Hear Me Roar Media. We're back at the same time next week. From myself, Carol Talon, and all the team here, stay safe.